Leaving shortly, so I'm going to keep this relatively short. A couple things from yesterday. The president signed 4 bills, SJ Res 34, which disapproves of the FCC regulations that would have imposed new privacy standard providers, allowing bureaucrats in Washington to pick winners and losers in the industry. We've discussed that before. HJ Resolution 83, which disapproves of a Department of Labor regulation extending the statute of limitations for claims against employers failing to maintain records of employee injuries. HJ Res 69, the disapproval of the Bureau of Land Management regulations that would limit Alaska's ability to manage hunting of predators on national wildlife refuges in Alaska. And H.R. 1228, which makes technical amendments to the appointment procedures of members of the Board of Congressional Compliance. One quick note, I mentioned this before, but we've now, the president has signed 12 congressional acts. In the past, all presidents combined had signed 1. So I think we have a vastly different attempt to roll back regulatory reforms that are standing in the way of freedom as well as business development. Also yesterday, the president spoke with the president of Peru and the president of Colombia to express his condolences for the devastation and loss of life by recent mudslides in the country. He offered the assistance to the United States government during this tragedy. The president also spoke with President Putin of the Russian Federation to condemn yesterday's attack in St. Petersburg. He offered the full in responding to the attack and bringing those to justice. We had readouts of both of those yesterday. With respect to today, this morning the president hosted a CEO town hall. I think some of you had the opportunity to go over there. The town hall was broken into 4 separate discussions: infrastructure, modernizing government services, workforce development, and the pro-business climate. A report released by the Pew Research Center yesterday showed a historic rise in public opinion about the economy. 58% of Americans say that the current economic situation in the United States is good, which is a 14% jump from last year, the largest one-year improvement. It's also the most positive Americans have been about the economy since before the recession. The American economy is already showing improvements under the president's pro-job, pro-business. The president was glad for the opportunity to speak to the CEOs from many industries about what his administration is doing moving forward to make it even easier to create jobs in America and making it even easier to do business in the country. This afternoon, in fact, literally momentarily, the president will be taking off the White House to go speak at the 2017 North America Building Trades Unions National Legislative Conference. I'm not going to get ahead of the speech, but I think it's fairly safe to say that he looks forward to speaking to the men and women who are building so much around our nation and the issues that mattered most to them, bringing back well-paying jobs, jump-starting American energy, rebuilding our infrastructure, and trade. Later this afternoon, the president will have several meetings, including EPA Administrator Pruitt, Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, Congressman Dana Rohrabacher, Governor Torres of the Northern Marianas Islands. And this afternoon, we will have a background briefing here in this room at 4:30 on the upcoming visit with President Xi at 4. And then tomorrow, I know we had mentioned earlier in the week that there'll be a Wounded Warrior Soldier Ride. We're obviously tracking the weather on that. But this is really a great opportunity, and I know that the team is working with several media outlets who want to cover this to really pay tribute to the men and women who have fought and served for this country, and some of the efforts that they are being made now to really go out and show how they've recovered so well and compete. Like we're going to have some rain. I'll make sure that we share any updates with you. Last, before I get on to your questions, we have a quick update on Syria. So, statement for you, and obviously, as I conclude, we will put it out. Today's chemical attack in Syria against innocent people, including women and children, is reprehensible and cannot be ignored by the civilized world. These heinous actions by the Bashar al-Assad regime are a consequence of the past administration's weakness and irresolution. Period. President Obama said in 2012 that he would establish a quote-unquote red line against the use of chemical weapons, and then did nothing. Period. The United States stands with our allies across the globe to condemn this intolerable act. John.
Thank you, Sean. I wanted to pick up on that statement. As you know, with this chemical attack on this rebel-held Syrian town, at least 100 deaths have been reported, at least 400 injuries. And I hope you could give some clarity in terms of the administration's position on Syria. Secretary of State Tillerson just days ago said that the Syrian people themselves should decide the future of the country. And at the same time, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, has said that Assad is a war criminal. So you just criticized President Obama's policy on Syria and the Red Line. What will the administration do in response to what we saw take place there over the past 24 hours?
Thanks. I think the statement speaks for itself. I think a couple things. One is statements by both Secretary Tillerson and Ambassador Haley speak to the political realities of the situation in Syria in terms of, I think we had opportunities in the past several years to look at regime change. I think those are fundamentally, the landscape is fundamentally different than it is today. That being said, I think the President has made it clear in the past, and I will reiterate that today, that he is not here to telegraph what we're going to do, but rest assured that I think he has been speaking with his national security team this morning. And we will continue to have that discussion both internally with our national security team as well as with our allies around the globe. But I think the statement pretty much speaks for itself, what we believe that is, and then we'll go from there.
Do you think there's any confusion with those two statements that I read earlier, one from Secretary of State Tillerson and the other from the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley?
No, as I say, one of them is just a statement of or both of their statements with respect to Assad speak to the political reality of, it's great to say, that there is almost an acknowledgement of the reality of the situation, politically speaking, in terms of his standing within the where we stand. There is not a fundamental option of regime change as there has been in the past. I think we would look like, to some degree, rather silly, not acknowledging the political realities that exist in Syria. And that what we need to do is fundamentally do what we can to empower the people of Syria to find a different way. Right now, those statements stand very squarely with what we will do today. I think that the comments in the statement are unequivocal when it comes to how we believe we view this attack on innocent people, the heinous nature of it. But I don't want to get ahead of where we're going from here. Hunter.
Just real quick, Sean, are you
hold on. Hans, I know.
I don't know if the point was to
okay,
me.
no, it wasn't. Hunter is Hans.
Hunter,
Hans.
Thank you, Sean.
I know, it's. I'll get back to you.
Thank you. I'm wondering if you're at all concerned to see these reports of the chemical attacks coming right on the heels of the administration suggesting it's open to Assad staying in power. Are you worried there's any correlation between the attacks and the change in posture?
No, I don't think that I would hardly characterize it as I forgot the way that you phrased it, but I mean, there's not a comfort level with Assad. I think it's a political reality. That being said, I think the idea that someone would use chemical weapons on their own people, including women and children, is not something that any civilized nation should sit back and accept or tolerate. And I think that is what we were making very clear today.
Right, but in addition to you describing Assad as the political reality, Ambassador Haley said the priority is no longer to sit there and focus on getting Assad out. That's a direct quote. So this is clearly a change in posture. Do you think there's any, correlation between sort of an almost increased brazenness on his part and those statements?
I don't, and I think that, like I said, I'm not going to get into it, but I think the President is extremely alarmed at these revelations. He continues to meet with his national security team, and I think there will be further discussions around the globe with our allies as far as the appropriate action. Hans.
Thank you, Sean.
Thanks, Sean. Are you certain it was the Assad regime? Is it possible that Russia was involved? Do you know the air platform? And then one final, do you know if any Russian forces were with Assad regime forces that launched the chemical attack?
Yeah, I'm not going to get into. I know that the President was briefed on this extensively this morning by his national security team, and I'm going to let the statement speak for itself because we feel very confident in the statement that we're making.
So that means no Russian involvement?
That means that the statement is very clear as far as who we believe is to blame and how we believe we're reacting to it. Zeke.
Thanks, Sean. In the statement, you were sharply critical of the past administration's policy with regards to Syria. I was hoping you can clarify, when does the president believe that he takes ownership of foreign policy? When, obviously, every president can always blame their predecessor. We need to put that criticism in this statement now, condemning the use of chemical weapons and a war crime overseas. Why take the pot shot as the predecessor? And when does the president truly?
Well, it's very clear. I mean, we drew. What's the point of red lines? America's credibility was at stake, and I think the president wants to point it out that it was a red line, and they did cross it. We did talk about, we did have alternatives to regime change, and they weren't taken. And I think that's a very, very different, important to acknowledge the difference in the change in our posture and how we will go out from here. So I think it is a big difference.
That change in the posture.
I understand. The statements speak for itself. I think I'm not going to get into what actions we're taking. Obviously, I get you want to do that. That's the decisions that the national security teams continue to make recommendations to the president. But until we do anything, I'd rather not get ahead of it.
So the next crisis, maybe it's not Syria. Well, is the president going to criticize President Obama for trade policies when he meets with President Xi later this week? Is it every foreign policy statement something happens?
It's going to depend. I mean, I don't want to say yes or no. I mean, I think that's going to depend on, what our posture was towards that country or regime or policy. I don't know. Did you ask that same question of President Obama when they literally spent a year or 2 years blaming the Bush administration for everything that was wrong? Right now, we're 70-something days into it. I think there's no question what their position was with respect to Syria in terms of red lines and regime change, and the lack of action that they did take. I think we want to make sure that we're very clear that there is a different posture.
Is President Trump willing to redline to discourage the Assad regime from using chemical weapons on his own people?
I think that the statement is pretty clear on this trade. The United States stands with our allies to condemn this intolerable attack, and I think going forward we will have more on this. But I'm not. I think we want to be very clear where we stand. I know countries throughout Europe are reaching out, making it clear what their position is. There's been some calls for action in the UN Security Council. I think at this point, as things develop, I'm not ready to talk about our next step, but we'll get there soon. Caitlin.
Does the White House agree with Rand Paul that Susan Rice should testify?
I think that's, again, I'm not going to start getting into who should testify, but I do think that it is, I know that she's about to make comments to a host to minimize this, but it is interesting. She was the one who went out and said she, quote, had nothing to do with this on a program a few weeks ago, and now, I continue to see more and more reports. So I think, it's not for me to decide who should testify or how they should do it, but I do think that there is a sharp contrast between a few weeks ago when she was very public and saying she, quote, had nothing, didn't have any clue what Chairman Nunes was. Now we're finding out that she's trying to figure out how she can go to some kind of friendly way of discussing this. But all yesterday there was an opportunity, from my understanding, of several people to think, except for, quote, one network described it as a person close to her, which I think is rather interesting, that you would assume that if you stood by the comments that you made several weeks ago, that you wouldn't need someone who just was close to you to defend it. So, Steve.
Networks like CNN saying that it's a diversion. The
Well,
Susan Rice story is a diversion.
I think speak for themselves. I find it interesting that I don't know how many. I get that at some point they have an invested angle and narrative in this, but the reality is, and again, I'm not going to keep going into every turn and twist about this, but I think that, as I noted yesterday, the more we find out about this, the more we learn that there was clearly something there and that there was a lot of activity. We both on the record and in comments talk about their activities. I think that it's interesting, as I noted yesterday, and I read some of the comments afterwards, but the default from at least some media outlets seems to be to rush to the defense of the Obama administration and the activities there instead of so-called want to get to the bottom of this. But there is an immediate attempt to defend certain actions like that on one side of the aisle and an immediate rush to judgment on the other side, which I get that people don't like to hear that, but that is the reality. If you look at the two situations that occurred, there's no question the way that some networks are handling one set of circumstances versus another, it is clearly an attempt to preserve a narrative and to defend one side of the aisle versus another. Steve.
John, generally speaking, would you like to see Assad step down or out of power somehow in Syria?
I think it's in the best interest of the Syrian people to not have anybody who would do the kind of heinous acts. Any leader that treats their people with this kind of activity and death and destruction, I mean, it's just, yeah, I don't think that anybody would wish this upon anybody.
And are you confident that the United States will respond to this attack in some?
I would not want to get ahead of the president at this point. I do think that the statement is fairly strongly worded for a certain reason.
And lastly, has he specifically talked to any allies about this morning?
I'm not sure that he's spoken to any leader specifically. I know the team has been in contact. He spent an extensive amount of time this morning getting briefed by the intelligence community as well as his national security team. Hallie.
Sean, so I want to follow on that, and then I have two other topics for you. You said, I know you don't want to get ahead of the president, and you're letting the statement speak for itself. You also said that you want to empower the people of Syria to find a different way. How will the United States help empower them?
Yeah, I don't think, again, we need to look at options at this point. I'm not going to get ahead of the president and the team. I think right now our concern is for the people of Syria and the victims of this attack. We have plenty of time to chart a way forward.
Okay, so let me just ask you this. On the Susan Rice story, you said yesterday you believe that it was moving in a troubling direction. What do you find troubling about that story?
Well, I find it troubling that someone would go out and talk about the fact that they, quote, had, and again, I'm paraphrasing because I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but I believe she made something to the comments. I have no idea what Chairman Nunes is talking about. And then through a person apparently that's close to her, continuing a narrative, but yet more that there was something there. And there's a question I've seen enough. You saw former Director Brennan talk about that if people were leaking this information, you have questions about what was the motive behind it. If it didn't have intelligence value, if it wasn't part of an ongoing investigation, what was the reason that somebody would have been amassed? The extent to which it goes. I think those are all very, there is a civil liberties component to this that should be very troubling in terms of the revelations that keep coming out.
But so to pick up on that, do you believe it is improper for a national security advisor to request the unmasking of names?
It would depend on the purpose of that. Again, it depends on the purpose of why they were asking and what they were trying to accomplish. But if
you believe this purpose was politically motivated,
no, I'm not. Please don't.
I'm not doing your mouth.
Well, you are. You said you believe.
I'm asking you.
Okay, and I think the answer is that I think why I'm saying that we're going in a troubling path is I think that what we continue to see is that there's a lot coming out that says there was no value in this intelligence. And so the question is, why was somebody unmasked if that was the case? What was the purpose of requesting it? And how, the extent of which it occurred? If there is no intelligence or criminal value in it, how far did they do it? Who did they share it with? But I believe that there are more questions than answers at this point.
My last question about healthcare. There's been a lot of discussion in the last 18 hours or so on the revival, potentially, of this healthcare bill. Speaker Paul Ryan said today it's in the concept stages, if you will. Can you talk about the White House's role in this and specifics? Are community ratings now on the table? Pre-existing conditions, will those be protected as the president made that?
I think yesterday, Chief of Staff Priebus and the Tuesday group folks here in the morning, I know the Vice President and Mr. Priebus went up to Capitol Hill later in the afternoon. I know they've got some additional meetings today. I believe back on Capitol Hill. They're having some folks here. The President had a discussion with a couple of members in the House and the Senate over the weekend. I think that our goal is, and I know Chairman Walden of the House Energy and Commerce Committee has been talking to his members in particular and members of the different caucuses and groups up there, and some ideas that he thinks could be very helpful. He's talked to leadership. I think if we can, the same narrative that we've been talking about for a while, if we can get that group to get to 216, then I think that we'll move forward. I think the talks have been very productive.
So it's back live, would you say?
I think the president, the president would like to see this done. If we can get a deal and it gets to those votes, which again, I'm not going to raise expectations, but I think that there are more and more people coming to the table with more and more ideas about how to grow that vote. And I think on both, not just in the House, but we've had some discussions as well as in the Senate. But I think both the Chief of Staff and the Vice President feel very optimistic with the tone of the conversation. And the ideas that are coming out and the willingness of folks to find common ground. John.
Sean, could you talk about this Eric Prince business, this idea that he was trying to create the president and Russia? His closeness to this administration, his sister being the education secretary, certainly creates an appearance, but could it also be problematic for the White House from the standpoint of, well, this is what the Obama administration might have been looking into in scanning intelligence reports?
Look, the thing that's interesting about the story is when you look at it, I mean, respectfully, I would call it flimsy. I mean, they use the first thing. The meeting took place around January 11th. He had no, quote, formal role with the campaign or transition team, although he apparently presented himself. He, quote, has ties to people, right? That's plural. When you go through the story, the tie that they have is that he appeared on Steve Bannon's radio show. When you look at the radio show, it says that he appeared on Steve Bannon's radio show in November. Steve Bannon gave up the radio show in August. I think that this idea that somebody who admittedly, on both sides, we say that he had no role in the transition, he says he has no role in the transition. But apparently he knows somebody who knew a guy in the UAE who also knew a guy in Russia, and they had to fly to the Seychelles on or around January. The Seychelles says, quote, they have no record of them being there. Government officials in the Seychelles, they were not aware of any meetings. But it is a bunch of flimsy pieces of information all tied together to create. But just so we're clear, there is no, they can't identify the other individuals. They claim that the Erik Prince who went, admittedly by himself, by us, by others, has no role in the transition, and that his connection, his quote, ties to people is one, he's related to what would become the Secretary of Education's sister, and two, is he appeared on someone's radio show. That doesn't seem to pass muster with a great deal of.
You acknowledge that this could be potentially problematic from the standpoint of this is you know, it could give Susan Rice an out to say, well, this was the sort of thing that we were looking at, and this is why we're conducting the masking.
Well, I think if you're looking at, I mean, you would hope that if that's what you were looking at, you'd get a lot more information than that. I mean, that to me, they don't know the date, who they met with, how they actually came into contact, what the exact ties were, or what supposedly happened as a consequence to this, because they can't. There was apparently nothing that came of it. So again, I get someone may have visited an island, but there's no proof they actually ever met with an individual, nor that they had any ties, nor that they actually know the exact date, nor any consequence of a so-called meeting. I think that it is flimsy at best. Blake.
Thanks, John. The president said earlier at that CEO town hall, as it relates to infrastructure, that the package would be $1 trillion, and then, quote, and maybe even more. Since $1 trillion is a massive number to begin with, what might and maybe even more mean?
I think that's part of what the team is working on. It's a number that's very consistent with what he has said since the beginning. So I don't know why this should be any different than. I mean, it's consistent with the numbers that he's used.
And then let me ask you about Dodd-Frank. He also said that he wants to take a haircut to it. Dodd-Frank is a law that the president can't unilaterally change. He can sign executive orders. So is he hoping to work with Capitol Hill for this major haircut? Is it solely through executive orders? How does that relationship?
Yeah, I think we'll have an update further on that at something. Obviously, there's clearly, as you know, a legislative component to this, and we'll have more on that. Yeah.
Thanks, Sean.
Yeah.
I want to follow up on Hallie's question about health care. The proposed changes to the essential health benefits and the community ratings, is there a concern that would roll back protections for pre-existing conditions? That's obviously something that President Trump said he wanted to keep in place during the campaign. So one of these changes that health policies are saying would get rid of those protections. Wouldn't that violate what President Trump knows?
And again, I would note to Hallie's question that we're not there yet. I mean, we're having discussions. It's as I said, the chief of staff hosted the Tuesday group yesterday morning, and then he and the vice president went up yesterday to talk to the Freedom Caucus. I think part of this is I get that there are disparate interests that are trying to pull this to one side or another, but I think that we understand the core principles of this, and we've got to make sure that we do whatever we do continues to get an outcome that grows the vote, not decreases the vote. And so I don't want to start prejudging where this thing is going to head at this point. I know the president's on his way. He's going to start speaking, so I'll catch you later. Enjoy. Thank you.
Do you know the type of gas that was used in the attack in Syria?